What if the next major war isn't fought between armies, but inside your own country? Not with bombs and tanks, but with debt, distrust, and division? Professor Jiang just laid out one of the most coherent frameworks I've heard for understanding why civilizations collapse from within, and why right now might be the most dangerous moment in the modern era. I'm breaking his argument down into segments, each one covering a distinct theme, and in each segment, I'm going to tell you where I think he's exactly right, where I think the picture gets more complicated, and what all of this actually means for the world you and I are living in. This is Mind Nutrients. Let's get into it. Segment 1, Reacting to 21st Century Warfare. Professor Jiang's opening point is the one that hits hardest, and I think it's actually being proven in real time. He says, nuclear weapons made traditional total war obsolete. You can't destroy a nation's factories and cities anymore without triggering mutual annihilation. So the new battlefield is internal, economic strangulation, infrastructure sabotage, information warfare, turning a population against its own leadership until the government can no longer govern. And here's what I want to add to that. This isn't new strategy. It's ancient strategy with modern tools. The Romans understood that you don't have to defeat an enemy in the field if you can make the people inside the walls distrust their own senate. Philip of Macedon famously said that a donkey loaded with gold could take any city, meaning bribery and internal corruption are more reliable than siege engines. What's changed is the speed and precision of that operation in the modern era. Social media algorithms, targeted sanctions, currency manipulation, debt traps, these are the siege engines of the 21st century, and they're nearly invisible to the populations experiencing them. Think about what economic strangulation actually looks like from the inside. It doesn't announce itself. It looks like inflation. It looks like your savings losing value. It looks like small businesses closing. It looks like young people unable to afford homes and quietly concluding that the system was never designed for them. By the time people recognize it as a coordinated strategy rather than just bad luck or bad policy, the damage is already done. The question I keep coming back to is, how do you defend against a war you're not allowed to name? Because the brilliance of this strategy, and I think this is the most chilling part of Professor Jiang's framing, is that it's specifically designed to look like organic internal dysfunction. The attacker never has to show their hand. The target country tears itself apart and calls it politics. Segment 2, Reacting to the Social Contract and Citizen Armies. This section is where Professor Jiang earns real intellectual respect from me because he goes to the root. He doesn't just describe what's happening, he traces it back to its philosophical origin. He takes us to Rousseau's general will and Kant's categorical imperative, the idea that the state isn't just a protection racket, not just a mutual defense agreement between people who happen to live near each other. It's a moral project. The state exists to express and protect the universal good, and citizens fight and die because they believe in that project. And that's the key insight I want to sit with here. French revolutionary armies didn't win because they were better trained or better equipped. In many cases, they were neither. They won because they were willing to die for something. Liberty, equality, fraternity, that's not just a slogan on a banner. That is an enlistment contract. It's the state saying, you matter, your dignity matters. This nation is yours, not just the king's. And in exchange, millions of ordinary men picked up rifles and marched. Now contrast that with a mercenary army. A mercenary fights until the math stops working. The moment the risk exceeds the pay, he walks. You cannot build a civilization on that foundation because the moment the civilization comes under existential stress, which is precisely when you need maximum loyalty, the mercenaries recalculate and leave. What Professor Jiang doesn't say explicitly, but what I think is deeply implied, is that the second a state can no longer deliver on that social contract, the willingness to sacrifice evaporates, and then you get one of two things. Either you get mercenaries or you get desertion. We are watching both of those happen in slow motion across multiple Western countries right now. Military recruitment is down. civic participation is down, the sense that the nation belongs to ordinary people, that it's worth defending, is quietly eroding. The Prussian response he describes, nationalism built on blood, iron, and shared culture, is also worth sitting with for a moment, because that model never really went away. It just went underground after 1945, buried under the weight of the Holocaust's memory and the liberal international order. But ideas don't die, they wait, and that particular idea is resurfacing now in Europe and Asia, and honestly in the United States as well. When civic nationalism fails, when the shared project falls apart, ethnic and cultural nationalism tends to fill the vacuum. History is very consistent about that. Segment 3, reacting to the American game. This is the part that I think is most immediately relevant to everyday listeners because Professor Jiang is describing us, the world most of us were born into. The American model took the abstract philosophy of Rousseau and Kant and turned it into something far more concrete and far more transactional. It reframed citizenship as participation in an economic game. The Constitution is the rule book. The government is the referee. Play by the rules, work hard, and the prize is wealth. That's the deal. Now here's my reaction to that framing. That model was extraordinarily successful, and its success over roughly 2 centuries is not something to dismiss lightly. It absorbed waves of immigrants from incompatible cultures and turned them into productive participants. It generated the highest material standard of living in human history for the broadest percentage of a population. It rebuilt Europe after World War II through the Marshall Plan and extended that game globally. But here's the structural flaw that was always baked in. When you reduce the social contract to work hard and get rich, 2 things happen inevitably over a long enough time horizon. First, the people who accumulate wealth early use those winnings to rewrite the rules of the next round in their favor. That's not malice. That's just rational behavior within the logic of the game itself. And second, the people who follow the rules and still don't win eventually stop believing the game is legitimate. And an illegitimate game is an unstable game. Professor Jiang is absolutely right that globalization was the export of this model to the entire world after the Soviet collapse. Francis Fukuyama famously called it the end of history. The idea that liberal democratic capitalism was the final destination of human political evolution and that we'd basically figured it out. What we're living through now is the painful acknowledgement that history never actually ended. It was just catching its breath and now it's back and it's picking up exactly where it left off. Segment 4, reacting to the reset thesis. This is the conclusion Professor Jiang builds toward, and it's the part I want to engage with most carefully, not to simply agree or disagree, but to genuinely complicate the picture. His core thesis, when inequality reaches a terminal level, when the majority of participants are buried in debt, when they are deemed economically useless by the system that was supposed to serve them, history's answer is a reset. The old order gets destroyed, usually through war, and something new gets built on the rubble. I think the historical pattern he's identifying is real and well documented. Ray Dalio has mapped the same cycle from a purely financial and macroeconomic angle, the long-term debt cycle, the wealth gap, the political polarization that follows, and then the conflict. Ibn Khaldun described essentially the same dynamic from a civilizational sociology perspective in the 14th century, watching Islamic dynasties rise and collapse in a predictable generational rhythm. And if you look at the 1930s, the last time global inequality reached levels comparable to what we're seeing today, the reset that followed was the most destructive event in human history, killing somewhere between 70 and 85 million people. So the pattern is real. But here's what I want to push back on, or rather what I want to add. A reset doesn't have to take the form of war. War is what happens when the system collapses before anyone successfully redesigns it. It's the outcome of failure, not inevitability. Consider the alternatives. The French Revolution was a reset, and yes, it was violent, but it produced the ideological foundation for the modern world. The New Deal was a reset. FDR restructured the relationship between capital and labor, created the social safety net, and arguably saved American democracy from the fascist movements that were gaining real traction in the 1930s. The post-World War II Bretton Woods order was a reset, building international institutions specifically designed to prevent the economic conditions that had produced two world wars in 30 years. Each of those moments was a fork in the road, and the difference between the peaceful resets and the catastrophic ones was whether there was a viable alternative on the table before the breaking point arrived. The 1930s produced both outcomes simultaneously. Roosevelt's New Deal on one side of the Atlantic, Hitler and Mussolini on the other. The question of which path a society takes often comes down to which vision gets there first. Closing takeaway. So here's what I want to leave you with after sitting with Professor Jiang's framework. He's giving us a map, not a destiny. The historical pattern he describes is real. Civilizations that stop delivering for their people do tend to reset, often violently, but a map isn't a sentence, it's a warning. And the value of a warning is that you can act on it. The real question for our generation isn't whether a reset is coming. The structural conditions Professor Jiang describes, the debt, the inequality, the collapse of civic faith, those aren't hypothetical. They're already here. The question is who designs what comes next, because someone is going to answer that question. The people who framed the general will answered it in 1789. Roosevelt answered it in 1933. And whoever answers it in the next decade or two is going to shape the world your children and grandchildren live in. That's why shows like this exist. Not to predict doom, but to understand the patterns clearly enough that we're not caught off guard by them. And maybe, just maybe, to be among the people who help design something better. If this episode made you think, share it with someone who needs to hear it. I'll see you on the next one.